Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Adrienne Celt's new book, End of the World House, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after over 95 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, booksellers, and the time of authors like Adrienne and Lynn, we wouldn't be here today. And we're truly appreciative of all of you. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Adrienne Celt for the launch of her new book, End of the World House. Adrienne lives in Tucson, Arizona. She's a cartoonist and the author of two previous novels, Invitation to a Bonfire and The Daughters, which won the 2015 Penn Southwest Book Award for Fiction. Joining Adrienne in conversation tonight is Lynn Steger Strong. Lynn is the author of the novels Hold Still, Want, and the forthcoming Flight. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, New York Magazine, Harper's Bazaar, the Paris Review, The Guardian, and elsewhere. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Adrienne and Lynn to the stage.
Thank you, Sabir,
Thank you so much. Yay.
Yeah. Adrienne and I were just talking. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. And it feels we're saying one of my favorite things about being a writer is the other writers you get to meet. And I was lucky enough to meet Adrienne. Our first books came out around the same time, and it's an incredible pleasure to get to do this and to know Adrienne. So we're going to start by having her read, and then we'll talk a little bit. So Adrienne, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to the Strand for having us. And thank you, Lynn, for being here. I love you. It's true. I saw that. A little troublemaker running around behind. My dog is not in my studio with me right now, but otherwise he would be making trouble. Everyone who knows Paul knows it's true. Okay, so I'm going to read from the beginning of the book because when you write a book that is organized in time loops, it can be sort of tricky to figure out how to excerpt it. So it just seems good to introduce you to the beginning. By the time they reached the Louvre, Bertie and Kate were nearly running. It wasn't unusual for their walks to turn into unplanned races. Both were in the habit of strolling a half step in front of people, and when they were together, this could become a problem. First, Bertie would move in front of Kate, then Kate would pick up her pace to match Bertie's, and so on and so forth, until they looked at each other and broke into a sprint. It had been that way since they were 15, that is, some 15 years ago, and on ordinary days they both embraced it, competing to reach an imaginary finish line, celebrating whoever won. But today, despite wanting to arrive at the museum on time, their mutual fear of looking un-French was helping them to approach moderation. At the end of the Rue de Rivoli, they slowed down and used each other as mirrors to readjust their outfits. A tug of the shirt when Kate lifted her eyebrow, and a twist of the skirt when Bertie sucked her teeth. The morning was hazy, with a fog that wasn't quite willing to resolve into rain, but was heavy enough to sit on the women's hair and dampen their jackets. Kate reached into her bag for an actual mirror, which she used to apply a fresh layer of lipstick. They'd come to the museum at the invitation of a man Kate had met the night before in a bar, and she claimed not to have decided yet whether she wanted to impress him. "What are your priorities art-wise?" Bertie asked. She had a handkerchief around her neck, meant to look chic but also useful as a breathing filter when they passed through areas still smoky from the last round of bombs. The tracking app they had poured over on the plane attributed responsibility to a terrorist faction from the suburbs who'd arrived via commuter rail wearing innocuous clothes and backpacks with gunpowder sewn into the lining. Now, Bertie shifted the knot of her handkerchief back to the side into its more fashionable position. "Do you want to hear something dumb?" I kind of want to see the Mona Lisa. It's not dumb, Kate said. Everyone wants to see the Mona Lisa. I mean, that's why it's dumb. Usually it's surrounded by a huge crowd, like hundreds of tourists, all crammed around this tiny painting, which is probably only an okay painting and which they only like because it's famous. So what, are you going to commune with it now that you're the only one there? This had been the man's offer, as they sipped their drinks and watched him glimmer lasciviously. Private entrance into the museum, which today was technically closed. If she was honest with herself, Bertie had in fact gotten a shiver of pleasure from the idea. I deserve it, she thought. If not me, who? But she wasn't about to be quite that honest with Kate, who would only make fun of her. Never mind, she said. We can skip it. I don't care. No, said Kate. We should see it. You're right. She snapped her lipstick shut and stowed it away again. Do you really think people don't like the Mona Lisa? Bertie shrugged. I just don't think most people have really thought about it. Should I stop there?
I mean, I could keep listening, but I was gonna save this question for later, but I feel like now I just have to ask it, and then we'll move on with our lives, which is just Adrienne Celt. Do you like the Mona Lisa?
What a wonderful question. What a sublime gotcha. Lynn asked me before the event started if I wanted to know her questions, and I said no. I think I would say that I appreciate the Mona Lisa. I've never had the strong urge that like I have to go to Paris and see the Mona Lisa. But when I do look at it, I think it's an incredible work of art. What was interesting to me about that painting and why I brought it into the book, especially so early on, is that I think that a lot of people, even people who do think about it, including me, your relationship with a painting that famous is almost not with that painting at all. It's reproduced so often and it's just so ubiquitous in society that I think it's almost the most unseen painting in the world because nobody really looks at it. I mean, this is a hot tip for anyone writing a book. A great reason to write a book is to set it in Paris so you have an excuse to go there. So while I was working on this book, my husband and I went to Paris and I went to the Louvre, and I had seen the Mona Lisa before because I had been to the Louvre before. But it's just the room is crammed full of people, and it is a tiny little painting, and it's behind bulletproof glass, and mostly what you see when you're there is everything except the painting. It's just people who aren't even looking at it, they're just holding their phones over their heads and taking pictures of it and taking pictures of the crowd, and so I guess I feel like I would love to love it. But I don't even know if I can have an unmediated experience with the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, there's so much in the book about all of the ideas you just talked about. I mean, not least sort of Bertie's tendency to take pictures, but also the sort of maybe our complete inability to differentiate between the idea of the thing and the thing itself. Maybe not least with Kate, but we'll get there because I want to go back to my one thing I wanted to sort of start with is just I really love the title, and
Thank you.
I love the title not least because I feel like it holds two of my favorite ideas that the book holds inside of it, or maybe ideas, but things that the book deploys particularly well, which is number one, and people who haven't read it, you probably caught it just now with Adrienne reading, there is this feeling that feels both different and not from our own world, that it is sort of the end of the world. And then there's also the house is this house that Kate and Bertie sort of say that if and when the world really starts ending, they'll get this house. And so I wanted to read this kind of incredible moment that happens a little bit later, and just sort of, and I'll give you a heads up because again, we didn't prep, we thought it would be fun, and now maybe we take it back. But
I was just giving you hell, Lynn.
Like, in what ways is this a book about making art at the end of the world, and in what ways is this just a book about being a person right now? And so I'm going to read a moment that felt, I just thought this was an incredible moment, not least because I'll give my cards. It just felt like being a person right now. The thing that made the world's collapse so hard to parse was the regularity that persisted in spite of everything. People still had air conditioning, for example. They paid their bills on their cell phones, and even as various foods were rationed, avocados disappearing when Mexico closed its border with the US, coffee and tea in the seasons of storms, motivated citizens were able to use online maps to track where and when truckloads of greenhouse produce were scheduled to arrive and plan photogenic rituals around them. Tomatoes glistening in a manicured grip, blackberries staining plump lips. Bertie felt it should be impossible to form such strong new habits and preferences when you might at any time be killed by an IED set up by the freeway. But it was possible. Oh, it was. So my question, what do you think?
I guess for me, it's hard to differentiate between the two ideas of the meaning of making art at the end of the world and being a person right now, because both of those are just like the way I'm trying to live my life, man. Yeah, I love that passage too, and it's one that my editor brings up, I feel like, every time we talk about it, the book, because I wrote that before the pandemic. I feel like me and our mutual friend Ruman Alam, like there are a lot of people who wrote accidental quarantine novels. And yeah, I started writing the book in 2017, and there were so many things that were beginning to feel disastrous, and so it's not even just how do you be a person at the end of the world. It's how do you be a person in late stage capitalism? How do you be a person when people have been commodified and identity has been commodified and moments in time have been commodified? And in all of that, is it possible to make art? I guess by having written a book, I would argue yes. But it's difficult, and when the act of making art has itself become something that you sell and become, part of your brand, it's like, does the being a person part fall the most to the wayside? It feels like sometimes, and that's really scary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like, again, this is and we talked, so the other thing about the house that I found interesting is that Kate and Bertie are purportedly the most important relationship in this book. And then that sort of shifts and that comes back and that changes. And I don't know if I believe in spoilers, but I will keep them at bay.
I think we can recognize that there is a turn halfway through the book and that there is a character named Dylan who becomes important.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. But a couple things about that. I mean, I would also say, so on the one hand, I appreciate there is a more granular end of the world, right? And again, I think a thing that I really appreciate about this novel is its ability to really beautifully navigate this idea of, yes, there are these intense and overwhelming external pressures, but also this woman's best friend is moving from the Bay Area to LA, and that's scary as fuck. Like that feels also like the end of the world.
Mhm.
So my first question is sort of, how did you think about or navigate these two things? Because again, one of the things I admire is just the way that you sort of properly prioritize our inability to or our tendency to not look outside of our like immediate ruptures and
Mhm.
sort of explosions.
Yeah. Well, obviously one of the massive themes of the book is friendship. And so it feels completely appropriate to me that the world is ending, not only because it sort of feels like it is even in our world too, but also because, as you sort of observed, when you lose a friend in one way or another, it always feels like the world is ending. And that's something. Strong friendship and the end of strong friendship is something that I don't know that we have a great vocabulary to discuss in our society, even though it's one of the most common experiences, because friends are the thing that we are least likely to prioritize in terms of like how we focus and build and structure our lives. But at the same time, another really important theme in the novel is stuckness in general, like just being stuck, the feeling of inertia. And I think Bertie in particular is, for so many reasons, both internal, personal, personality based, and also external, like people that she's lost, the things that are happening in the world. She's absolutely terrified and frozen in place. And I don't think she totally knows that about herself. And so she has projected a lot of that and like a lot of her life's structural stability onto Kate and onto Kate's presence, not only in her life, but right there in her life. You know, they've sort of been best friends at the end of the world. They've been each other's buddy in the darkness when it is truly dark. And she, yeah, I think she wants to hold Kate in place in that way. And so that allows, I mean, that creates a need that has an obvious obstacle, thinking in terms of storytelling basics, which is that Kate's also a person. And she, you know, Kate has her own needs and her own desires, and arguably maybe a slightly healthier sense of self and of her desire to, you know, progress and explore in the world. She maybe doesn't necessarily think it will end her friendship with Bertie. But I think what's interesting about that to me is that Bertie thinks that Bertie thinks that her fear and her desire to contain Kate is an act of love for Kate, but it's actually very much her reaction to her own internal state and her own internal projection of Kate. So it's kind of the reason I think that she's scrabbling and like scrambling so much is that she's like reaching for something that already isn't there, which is the version of Kate that exists in her mind being there present in front of her. Yeah.
Well, and also it feels like almost because Kate to me is kind of an absence, but in exactly the way that you're describing, very purposefully constructed by you to show like a way of approaching friendship that feels deeply recognizable to me, right? As like Bertie can't help but make it about herself. So I think what sort of was thrilling to me about as I progressed through the novel is that to me, the most important relationship became Bertie and her art, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of turns out to be right. Like again, I've read to the, but I wonder again about that idea. And Kate is a writer, and Bertie is an illustrator. Adrienne Celt is both. And I wonder about that, and even thinking about narratively, right? Like that's a really hard narrative arc to create, especially with two characters. I mean, Kate basically sort of stays stuck. Bertie is stuck for a good amount of the time. They're both stuck for very reasonable and recognizable reasons with regard to late stage capitalism and work and money, etc. But in what ways is this a book that is almost like a love story? Again, maybe I'm projecting my own shit, but like between Bertie and her work. And how did you think about that, especially in terms of stuckness and especially in terms of loops?
I love that. I do think that it is. I mean, because probably Bertie's relationship to her work is the one relationship with regards to which she truly grows over the course of the novel. I mean, that's not exactly true. She does grow and change, but she grows intentionally and methodically in relationship to her work. And it's a well that has sort of run dry for her at the beginning of the book, because in her late stage capitalism situation, she has a day job, and it's a pretty good day job. And so she's able to work and live and put on blinders about what's going on in the rest of the world to as great a degree as possible. But that has sort of alienated her from her sense of ambition and momentum. And so you know, what the book does is start stripping away all of the things that she's clinging to that make it impossible for her to work. And so she starts to work again. And the way that the time loops work in this book, for people who haven't read it, I mean, we've comped it to like Russian Doll and Groundhog's Day a lot, because those are obvious like cultural touchstones. But something that's really different is that in these time loops, Bertie and Kate aren't aware of the loops, or at least they're not consciously aware of them. And so there's this subconscious accrual of knowledge and self-knowledge that happens over the course of each of the repetitions. And that, I don't know that I put it this way to myself as I was working, but since you framed the question that way, I do think that that's a very accurate description of how it feels to write and to revise a book and to just come to ideas, because so often something has been kicking around in the back of your head and you haven't even been aware that it's there. You haven't been aware that it's part of you, but it is. I mean, my last book, End of the World House, my previous book, Invitation to a Bonfire, is, it was inspired by the marriage of the Nabokovs, and you very inflected with Nabokovian language. And I hadn't ever planned to write that book, but I had studied Russian and I had studied Nabokov, and I had, for the past 10 years. So like by the time the book came to me, I didn't have to do any research because I had done all of the research over the past 10 years. And similarly, like there are elements of my life and of, frankly, like my own shit that I brought to the writing of End of the World House that you don't have to plan it. It's such a funny thing about art, like writing in particular, but I think any art probably, that you are working all the time because the work is just being alive. It's just being a human being and letting the feelings and the ideas and the concepts and the themes and all of it just like build up in you until it pours out. Yeah.
Yeah, I both love that, and the teacher in me is like, yeah, but Adrienne, there's a lot of work and we have to talk about the work. But I do think that is partially my next.
We could talk about the revisions.
Well, yeah, because I think like, okay, so this is a thing that I constantly find myself thinking, both to students and also in my own work, is sort of, where are we in time and space, right? It's sort of a go-to, right? Like you embed your reader in time and space. And if you embed your reader in time and space, they can track the character in a certain way. And you basically tied both hands behind your back, right? And yet I feel like for the past couple of years, especially, and it's really interesting because like you said, I feel like a lot of these books that feel most in conversation right now were written prior to that, which is also just something for all of us to unpack in therapy. But like the particular way that like time is so much more elastic, and even space is so much more elastic, and also the way that like space holds inside of it so many different versions of being a person at the same time, right? Like we walked by the apartment where we did remote school with my kids today, and I was like, remember, this is where we did our pod, right? And like every space contains so much inside of it, and every time contains so much inside of it. And I think one of the beautiful things about the book is that like it starts to just feel true, right? Like it stops feeling like a trick, and it starts to feel like, no, of course Bertie would think about being 15, but I have a but, which is, it feels craft wise hard as hell, right? Like it feels right. So like I wonder about, again, back to this idea of like you've tied your hands behind your back. Like how did you think about, and accrual I think is a really, like, that's a word I think about a lot. Like how did you think about accrual, and how did you think about movement in a book that's so filled up with repetition?
Yes. And this question ties really interestingly to what I was just saying, because it was this odd ballet between intuition and really fucking hard work. Because on the one hand, so the beginning of the book, the time loops are progressing pretty normally, in the sense that like the day repeats, and that's straightforward enough. And then shit goes off the rails in a certain sense when the turn happens midway through. And so both of those things were essentially intuitive choices. I don't know. I mean, making it a time loop was a purposeful choice, because I was interested from the very beginning in the idea that the structure of a novel can provide the plot and the heart of a novel. because it always kind of does, but we usually hide that behind the characters and behind the events, and like act as though structuring the book is an afterthought. And I just thought, what would it would be really fun if this was incredibly visible, and like what would that feel like? So what was important to me about the loops was that even though the events of the day would be progressing the same way, I mean, would be repeating to a certain extent, that it would be palpable for the reader still that the characters are progressing and changing. So, you know, there's still forward momentum in the story, essentially. And some of that was tricks, like, okay, chapter 2 starts earlier than chapter 1 does. So even though the day is repeating for Bertie and Kate, we get to see something that's fresh and that we didn't see before. And then there are like little signposts that I chose along the way, like the people who are in the courtyard before they go into the Louvre are always sort of the same, but a little bit different. So we start to get the feeling of things happening and shifting. And then I guess in terms of thinking about it, of like, where are people in space and time, I think that even when you're writing something strange and structurally confusing, or, you know, fluid, where time is kaleidoscoping, you know, closer and farther, there's still always bodies in space. The person is always still in the place that they are. And so if you try to be as honest and as clear as you can about the experience that they're having, that's still going to be your best guide, even though it seems like things are getting incredibly crazy and chaotic around them. And so that was always the guide, and that allowed me to, you know, make the more intuitive choices. But the fact that I did change sort of, I didn't change the rules, I just clarified the rules midway. Did make it a lot harder, mainly because I was faced with the struggle of like how much to explain versus not explain, because explaining things in fiction can get kind of tedious. And so I, again, though, like going back to the bodies in space and what they're doing and what they're thinking, and like, how is this person breathing right now? How are they feeling in their body? Why would this moment send them back to being a 15-year-old? Because I feel like I can picture exactly the moment you're talking about when you reference that.
Yeah.
There's a lot more soccer in earlier drafts of the book, which, as a person who has now watched Yellow Jackets twice, I think back on wistfully. So anyway, like, intuitively, I made all of these choices. I threw up a bunch of things onto the page, but I was trying to shape it, like, because I had made a like powerful structural choice at the beginning, I was always shaping it from early on. And the tinkering, though, was really difficult, because in any novel, a change you make will have cascading consequences, like forwards and backwards. Like, it'll change what is able to happen next, and it'll change, it might affect like what led up to this, because like the possibilities have to now lead up to the new choice. And in a time loop, that means you have to be aware of that every single loop. And you also have to think about like, okay, but if I made a weird choice, like to switch things in loops 3 and 4, now that it repeats more, so do I have to put a different so anyway, there's a lot of tinkering, lots and lots of tinkering. But what I found really interesting about that process was that the longer I tinkered, and tinkering is such an innocent word for what it was a lot of, so much more crying than the word tinkering implies, was that the emotional truth of the book also became clearer and clearer to me. Like, there's a moment where this character Dylan, who comes into the book later, it describes something about himself to Bertie that I wrote in a very early draft that didn't quite make technical sense, or at least it didn't have a technical explanation until the last draft of the book. And as soon as it did, in a section that just sort of emerged out of how I revised a section in the middle of the book that I had revised so many times before, it was just such a beautiful moment of clarity, because it was like the purpose and the truth came together in that way that it sometimes does in fiction when you've been beating your head against it. And it's just like, of course, it couldn't have been any other way than this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because revision is a time loop, right? I mean,
It adds
revision
so
is
much.
accrual. I mean, even like the sort of gestures. I love a good gesture, and I hope everyone saw Adrienne's. They were good, but like, the revision is, I feel like, is that sort of like deepening and deepening and deepening, which is so much of what the book feels like. Which again, I think what I love about it is it taught me to understand that this was truer, right? Like, which again, I think is what fiction is here to do. I have a couple questions and a comment. The comment is, I feel like one of your brilliant choices was to put it in Paris, because to my mind, the food does such great, like I can still think of that omelet with chev cheese and green onions and French fries, like, and I sort of want it. Like, there's a lot of great food, and I feel like that you do that so well, and that's connected, I think, to my question, which it's connected to what you just said, which is like, if the novel is a container and you were really interested in structure, the particular container of the Louvre as the place, which is connected to the Mona Lisa, but I also think is separate, even just again in terms of like, I've been in museums the past few days with children, and it's like there's such specific spaces. So I just wanted you to talk about sort of, and they also do such specific things to art, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, I almost feel bad for painters in terms of like what I think they do, but I don't want to know. I want to know what you think they do. So talk about the Louvre and talk about museums as like the particular space that you chose to let this time repeat.
Yeah. I love museums. I mean, that isn't to say that I don't find them and the curatorial approach, problematic in its own way, which I will get to. But I just physically, as physical spaces, I find them very peaceful, and I can spend hours and hours and hours in them. I have been to the Met like as many times as I've been to New York, and I will continue to go back there no matter how many times friends of mine in New York laugh at me for just like looking at the paintings when I could be looking at the armor. But I like the paintings. And oh, this is a funny side note about that. The art, the photo I have in this book,
So
I
good.
took it. My whole goal was to look like a John Singer Sargent girl in that picture, and I think I nailed it.
You look incredible.
Thank you. I took that picture at AWP with Adrienne Mathowitz photography. She is very talented. But so the Louvre in particular as a museum, so museums in general, I think that one thing that they do, besides provide this incredibly peaceful space in which people can come together and do the most beautiful thing that crowds of people can do, which is have experiences alone together. It provides this venue for people to have personal interactions with art, but it also highly, highly mediates them. And it makes these choices about what you will see and therefore what you will find important in the world of art, and therefore in a lot of ways in the world. And that's kind of terrifying to me, because it complicates that personal interaction in so many ways. And I don't know how it could be otherwise in a certain sense, like, because this isn't just true of museum art, it's true of books and the way that they are presented to people, it's true of television. And it's just true that like when something gets word of mouth and like takes off and becomes famous, it suddenly people like it more. And they don't think about it that way. And I don't exclude myself from this by any means. Like, I don't say this as a judgment. It's just a fact of humanity that we get excited about things when everyone else is getting excited about them, and people, so more people talk about it, and then more people see it, and yet we are still so the focus of the entire world is being put on a few different things, and like while other things are being set to the side. And in a museum, that's literal. Like, there's so much art in any museum that is literally just hidden away in storage, that is probably like transcendent beauty. And yet that doesn't elide the fact that the individual experience with the art is still very pure and very beautiful and very intimate. And like the art that I love most in the world, I love because it feels like it only exists for me, and like it was made for me, and it and I live in a world where it's just us and nothing else exists. And everyone who loves that art has that same exact experience with it. And the Louvre I chose was for two reasons, partially because it is sort of the example of museums in that way. It is like the most grand. It's in a literal castle. It's in Paris. It is, it's bringing together art from these particular eras that are extremely venerated, and yet like very curated in our awareness of what was being made in those periods of time on Earth. Side note, the giant corporate behemoth of booksellers has categorized End of the World House as Renaissance literary criticism. So for a brief period in the past week, my novel has been a #1 bestseller in Renaissance literary criticism. My apologies to all Renaissance literary critics. But so it is just, it's a symbolic place that is, it's sort of the place where all of these forces, not just in art, but like in society generally, like where wealth stratifies and where people like Bertie and Kate, who are in a middle-class Western situation, are able to accrue and sort of ignore the fact that that means that other people are losing. And so, yeah, so the Louvre brings together all of those elements for me. And like, just for in a very like pure American way, like Paris is for fancy bitches. Like that's where people go. People have, live their entire lives dreaming of going to Paris. It's like a bucket list thing. They want to go to Paris. They want to go to the Louvre. They want to see the Mona Lisa. And they're not wrong to want that. It's a beautiful thing to do. But it's also odd to share a dream with so many people. It's, yeah. And then the second weirder reason that it had to be in the Louvre for me was that as I was thinking of this book, I was walking my dog and listening to podcasts, which is something I do all the time. And at some point in some podcast or other, somebody misspoke and said the phrase private Louvres. And I was just like, private Louvres, yes, that's it. That's all of the things. It's the women, and they're there alone, and it's private lives, and it's private loves, and it's like everything existing in the same space and being a little bit wrong and being a little bit wonky. And so I just really fell in love with it from that point. And so I couldn't have said it anywhere else.
I love that. I love that so. I'm going to think about that a lot. I want to just tell people that we're going to go to questions in a minute. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask one more in the meantime. And this is one of my sort of curveballs, but let's play, which is just one thing we haven't talked about that I love about the book a lot is that in addition to time loops, there is then, and I was thinking about it too a lot, Adrienne, when you were just talking in terms of like, this art exists for you and only you, except that happens to other people too. And in later parts of the book, it very literally grapples with this idea of like alternate versions of a self. And so my specific Adrienne question is there, and also I will say, I read your lovely Lit Hub essay about sort of a sort of nemesis, which I feel like was sort of this, but this is a different question, which is just to say, like, is there an instance or a person without whom or which you feel like you would be a different version of yourself, maybe specifically as an artist? Like, I think like as a writer, as an illustrator, as a person who's trying to make things in late stage capitalism at the end of the world, like, is there something you could think of or name as like, this happened, and then because of that, you continued on or off of a path as an artist?
That's such an interesting question.
I mean,
it could, no. It's almost better to not be prepared, because obviously I could literally say almost anyone.
Yeah.
And I guess somebody who comes to mind is, and this is going to be sort of a heavy answer, is my father-in-law, who I adored and who passed away the year that I graduated from graduate school. He got sick, and he was sick for about a year, and then we lost him. And When I graduated, this this terrible year when all of my friends and I, who had been focusing intensely on art and had been in this incredible bubble where we only believed that we mattered and we only believed that we existed and we were only competing against each other and that was all the world would ever be. And we were just going to go off and do fantastic things. And then we got hit in the face with the sledgehammer of reality and like went to work in grocery stores and went to teach, like be an adjunct, and went to work in tech. And in my case, we went and moved to Wisconsin and lived with my mother-in-law and my father-in-law while my father-in-law was very, very sick. And then my brother-in-law came, and he was just supposed to, we were planning to stay because our lives had just upended in such a way that it was possible for us to do that. But my brother-in-law and his now wife came to stay with us too, planning to only be there for like a week. And while they were there, my brother-in-law was also diagnosed with cancer and ended up staying with us for 6 months. And so at the beginning of that time, when it was unclear how long we would be there and how long my father-in-law would be there, I remember Dave and I and his parents were talking in the kitchen about like, what were we going to do next? Like, how long would we be here? I was sort of applying for jobs idly, and I had been applying for fellowships and had come close on a couple of them, but hadn't gotten them. And my father-in-law said like, well, why don't you view this as the Clark Family Fellowship and you just stay here and like write with us, and that will be, and you can just put that on your CV. And at the time I was like, well, obviously we're going to stay here. But also I was like a little bit bristly because I was like, no, I want to be famous. I want to get the things. I want to succeed. And now I just think about that moment all the time because it was just the most generous, beautiful, loving, pained, desiring offer. It was like he loved us and he wanted us to be there. And we were privileged that we were there. Like we were in the house the morning that he passed away. And it was this beautiful September morning in Wisconsin, just perfect weather, ideal blue sky. And that day I had been planning to go to Chicago and teach a class at Story Studio, just like a one-day class. And I ended up going because we were all like, I don't know, what would you do if you stayed here? Like, you should go, I guess. And it was horrible. I mean, I hope the class went okay for the students, but I was out of my mind. And yeah, but that will always be part of me, being a part of that family in that moment and like being privileged to be there with them and see that change in all our lives, and lose Doug, who we loved so much, and it was just such a funny, loving, kind, caring, giving person. Like that definitely changed who I was forever, and it changed how I thought about writing and making choices about where I wanted to be and what I wanted to be doing forever.
I was not prepared for that. Now I'm crying. But it was really, I mean, I can't fathom. That was beautiful. I'm going to just ask the other questions because I'm not totally functional at the moment. No, it was beautiful. And what's incredible about that response is that it also feels connected to what you said earlier, right? In terms of like, you're always just like the depth of that experience as a human is inextricably linked to the depth of that experience as a writer, right? And those two things aren't, what you wanted to be was great, right? And one of the reasons you're great is because of him. And like fellowships are supposed to be proof that you're great, but like they're dumb. It's like three people sitting in a room.
It was so much better and so much more important that I was there, and like not for my art, although it did change my art, of course, but just because it was my family. Like,
right.
That was where we had to be.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, I'm gonna ask Jaylene's question first. Does your decision to see if structure plot could be the heart of the novel related to your work? Is your decision to see that related to your work as a comic artist? It seems like structure has a much more visible effect in that genre.
That's such a great question. I don't know that it consciously was when I chose to do it. Because as a prose writer, I've always been interested in constraints and form anyway. Because I think that when you're just starting out writing, you think that like constraining yourself in any way is going to be a mistake and it will like shut down your creativity. And then like we all discover very early on that in fact, somehow if you put a box around things, like the inside gets so much bigger than the outside. But I do think in a behind the scenes in my subconscious way, it absolutely is related. Not just because you're right, like structure in a comic is important. Like I've been doing a webcomic for the past 11 or so years, and that comic is literally constrained to 4 panels. And so like anytime I break out of those panels, it's a really conscious choice and it always feels wild. And that, you know, what I'm able to do within the panels is it's different than it would be if I was drawing something more long form. And I have been thinking a lot about what I would want to draw if I drew something like in a novel length, because around the time that I was working on revisions of End of the World House, I was drawing a lot, and I was doing illustrations for the book, not the ones that ended up in the book, although I think they probably spun out of that, but just like illustrations that kept me in the world of the book when I was having trouble with revisions. And I was like, I want to be in this place, but I don't want to think consciously about this place. So I would put on Seinfeld and I would do watercolors. And now I have this weird alternate version of the book illustrated in watercolors because some of the scenes that I illustrated are not in the book anymore, which I love. But so I started working also on just like laying out a graphic novel idea that I had, that I was like, what I want to do is I want to make this super straightforward so that I can like let the pictures be more wide ranging and do like the thematic and like motif work. But I found that was really hard. It was hard for me to remain interested in a story that I had thought of initially as like with my prose mind, in a visual way, because the structure of them is so different. Like the density of detail in a novel or a short story exists in the language, because that's all there is. So it exists in the structure of the book, it exists in the language of the book, and like your explorations also take place there, your discoveries take place there. And I felt like I was being constrained in terms of the amount of discovery I was able to make because in that project. And so I sort of set it to the side. And what I've realized in the like ensuing, I guess, years now, is that I am still interested in that story, but what I'm most interested in is the way that I want to like burrow inside it with my critical mind and like pick it apart and talk about it. And so I think that I may at some point like sort of combine it with memoiristic writing and graphic writing and sort of like pick it apart and talk about it as a book and as it relates to my life. And sort of I made this gesture, speaking of gestures, as Lynn was earlier, I made this last night for a different reason, and now I'm going to explain it again to you guys. I want to like expand it and look at the insides of it. This is me like being a TV computer person where you can like tap a flat image and then like open it up and see all of the particles inside and the data it contains. So I think that my thinking about prose and my thinking about comics have really fed each other and are structurally related, and have like that my thinking has like really like grown and fractalized as a result of thinking about them both. Yeah, so I mean that's a great question.
I love that. I mean, I have follow-ups, but there are other people with questions. I'm giving it to them, but I feel like that's sort of an endlessly fascinating question and answer. The next one is, there's such an association with time in museums. How did that work with the time loops? Is there a connection drawn between looking back and the repetition?
I mean, I would say certainly yes. Yeah. I mean, because museums are little flip books of history. And they are also, but they are also like weird time dilations in and of themselves, just as a person walking through them, because you can spend so many hours in a single room of a museum, just like bopping between different different pictures, and like, oh, suddenly hours have gone by. And you can also traverse time, so and make these connections that took decades and centuries for the art world to make granularly and automatically, like intuitively, just like by being people in the world. You can look at one picture from the 1300s and then jump to the 1500s and be like, I see how this led to this. And it's such incredible time travel, and it's also such incredible jet lag. Like Bertie talks about the time travel in terms of jet lag at one point in the book. And I do think museums can have that effect on you, because you are jumping through time. It tires you out in a way that you maybe don't realize. I could just be speaking for myself right now, like, but this is certainly my experience of museums. That you go into so many deep places in a museum, and part of it is historical and part of it is personal. In the sort of like Proustian Madeleine sense, like you see an image that strikes you, and you realize like you saw it in a picture book when you were a little girl, or you just see something and it just reminds you of a place that you've been, and you realize it was that place. And it's just like there's so many of those connections. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah, I love one very small thing, which is just, I was reading your book we were at the Met for a really long time, and we left the Met, and my 7-year-old, we were walking back, my 7-year-old lay on the floor and said, do you feel like this has been the longest day of our lives? Which is just to say, like, she feels Bertie's jet lag. I was thinking of Bertie, and it felt relevant. Anyways,
oh, that feels totally relevant, and that's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, she was on a New York sidewalks. It's a choice, but okay. Next question. What was the process working with your editor on this book? How did you relay the different tenors you were aiming for with each loop?
That's a great question too. My editor, Karina, for this book was so wonderful and so collaborative from the very beginning. She actually, when she read the book on submission, she asked if she could do can I call you and talk to you about this before I make the offer on the book, so I can make sure that I understand it and that I understand it the way that you want it to be understood, and that we could like work together on the revisions. And we had this incredible conversation. And one of the things that stands out to me about it, besides the fact that she did buy the book, thank God, was that one of her suggestions I totally shut down. Like, it was a big suggestion. I was like, no, that won't work. It would kill the book. And she was like, okay. Which is exactly what you want in an editor who is like who has a vision for the book that you that you have. That they would like, they'll take big swings with you, but ultimately you're the one who has to take the swing. So they let you make the call. And we did a few big revisions of the book, and some, I mean, I wouldn't say that it was similar to how I had been revising the book up to that point, which is that she would give me big like thematic or like large scale edits to work on, and then we sort of like honed in, and sometimes we were doing a full revision of the book, and sometimes it was just like both of us like, we know this part isn't working, so Adrienne is in a time loop again. And I would just like print out the same 20 pages over and over and over and over and over again, which is why I thank the trees that died for this book in the acknowledgements. And yeah, so it was stressful, but not because of her, because revising a book is stressful. And it was great because she was so willing. She did have so much vision for it from the beginning, and I could tell from the very first time we talked that she shared my vision for it. And So the things that we ended up, cutting or changing were always because we were trying to get closer to this shared vision for what the final product would be. And one way that I think about it, I can't remember exactly when I read this book. I think Matt Salis has recommended it on Twitter at some point. There's a book called The Conversations, and it's between the novelist Michael Ondaatje and the film editor Walter Murch, I think is his name. And because there's just like such incredible consonance between the way you edit a film together and the way you write and edit a novel, and it's just incredible. I love that book. And at some point, Walter Murch is talking. I'm going to slaughter this, but I'm going to do my best to explain why it mattered. He was talking about how you cut things down, like how you cut your darlings, and that how like sometimes if you're trying to communicate blue in a scene in a movie, and you have a blue filter or like a blue light on the scene for the entire time, for a long time you might feel like that's essential, and it's the way that you like that big statement is how you communicate blue in that scene, which has to be there. And yet it feels like it's not working for some reason. And at some point he was like, you take off the filter, even though that feels like you're killing the blue in the scene, which has to be there. And then once the filter is gone, you realize how many other little pieces of blue are still in the scene, in the curtains and in the sky and in a lamp and in a throw pillow and in like the shirt and somebody's eyes. And they were always there, and you were building them, and you just don't need the crutch of the light filter anymore. And I think there were things that we cut and changed that felt like that to me. And that like thinking about it that way really helped me as I was doing it, because it's like, oh, okay, I thought I needed this to express some element of the book, but it's already there. It's there in so many ways. So I can make this big cut or this big change, and that's fine. I'm not losing anything. And yeah, those cuts can feel really good once you finally decide to do them.
I love that. So I have, again, so much to say, but we have one more question. We only have 2 minutes, and I'm just going to ask it really quickly, but I feel like that all related back to time loops. This is for Adrienne and Lynn, but I'll answer quickly, which is just writing. Which novel of yours has taught you the most about craft?
Ooh, it could be any of them, but I mean, I'm going to say this one just because it is so structure-y, but every book teaches you something different. You basically, I think a lot of people say this, but it's true. You learn to write a book anew every time you write a book, because they're all incredibly different and they have different demands, and they basically are different universes. And so you just have to figure out the craft elements that allow you to write that, like write to that universe, like look into that window to the greatest possible degree. And then of course each of the books teaches you to write the next one, because you learn things, you get a little bit more economical, you get a little bit more audacious, you know your craft better. So you almost can't pick one, but I guess I'll just pick the most recent one because it's the one I want you to buy right now.
Well, and again, I feel like that's all the ways that End of the World House is, in addition to wholly being itself, right? Which I feel like is a really important thing for metaphor. Like, I feel like the book exists as itself, first and foremost, but there is also a way to read it as a really beautiful metaphor for making things, right? Mm-hmm. And so like every book teaches, I mean, so Marie, my answer is the same as every book has taught me something new, but it's taught me something new because, like Bertie, every new day is accruing, is standing on the shoulders of all the work that's been done before. Yeah.
And I also think that you ultimately, when you're spending as much time with something as you do with a novel, you can no longer separate craft from the emotions and from the people of the book. So I also guess in that same way can't choose one book that taught me more about craft, because they all, like, the craft was always in the heart of the book too. And you use your heart as much as you can in every moment of your life.
I love that. I feel like we should land there. That's a perfect place to land.
Well, thank you, Adrienne and Lynn. That was such a fantastic, interesting, writerly conversation to dig into. I really appreciated it, and I'm sure our audience did as well. If you, to our audience, have yet to purchase a copy of End of the World House, the link is in the chat. It will also be emailed to you again tomorrow. And that note.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you.
Adrienne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabir.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Well, it
Good
was
night, everybody.
truly my pleasure. Have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Bye.